This is Oracle Oriah, and I have a special guest in my series of interviews. Today, I am so excited to interview Stephen Mehler, and he is an alternative Egyptologist that I am so fortunate to have convinced him to do this show with us. And I am so excited because we're going to be talking about matriarchy and in the history of ancient civilization and Egyptology. He has a master's degree in women's study. He has been studying matriarchy for 55 years. I've heard him speak. He gives me chills. I love him to death already. He doesn't even know me yet, but I cannot wait to launch into this. So Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. And I love your story. I love your story of Hakim, your guide that you met in Egypt, and how he kind of opened the doors to you in all of these alternative Egyptian historical wisdom teachings, right?
Right.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about, just a starting point, it's a huge topic, but
Yes.
let's just begin on talking about matriarchy.
Yes. As you and I have discussed, this could be the first of many sessions.
And I hope so.
and before we launch into the field that I created with my teacher, which we call Kemetology instead of Egyptology, it's great to start with what is the basis of a lot of what our teachings are, and that is matriarchy. So it's an idea that's a great foundational way to start. So many people may ask, what is matriarchy? What does that mean? Well, if you go by a dictionary definition, it is a social system in which descent goes from mother to daughter, called matrilineal. And it says usually the social structure is with the woman's tribe. So that's a good start. That's a good basis. However, the last time I was in academia was in the 70s, but I've kept an eye on academia, what's going on. When I was in academia, especially in the 60s, if you took a class in anthropology, they would tell you there has never been a true matriarchy on our planet. And they would dismiss the subject and then go on.
That's amazing.
Well, that bothered me.
Yeah.
But what I found out was, because I am a prehistorian, that's really what my background is, in archaeology and prehistory. I noticed that the fault wasn't with ancient civilizations, it was in the definition that they were doing of matriarchy.
I see.
In other words, we are led to believe that if it's the same as patriarchy, that means women were on top, ran everything, and men were subservient. And that's not true at all. So we say to them, yes, the more I studied ancient cultures, the more matriarchies popped up in front of me. And of course, my favorite interest was Egypt. It started with Egypt. So to let people understand, a lot of people, as you and I have discussed, think that this feminism now is just a new thing. That now young women, especially women in their 20s who are marching in the streets, are now demanding rights, saying we've never had rights, we've never been equal, we've never been free.
Right.
And they think it's a new thing. Well, this wave of feminism is the first in the 21st century, but in the 20th century, there were 3 waves of feminism. And in the 19th century, there were also 3 waves of feminism. So let's go back 200 years to bring it to where we want to be today. And in fact, it was my wife who was a great teacher in English literature. She still teaches online. She was an English professor at Metro State University in Denver. She taught English literature. So when I was starting to prepare this talk, I was discussing with her, and she said, wait a minute, you forgot the first wave of feminism in the 19th century happened around 1819, 1820.
First wave of feminism in the modern civilization.
Modern times, yes.
Wow.
And one of the leaders was a 17-year-old lady named Mary Wollstonecraft. Does that name sound familiar to you?
Not at all.
She wrote the Frankenstein. She is the
Oh,
author.
yes.
At 17 years old, she wrote Frankenstein.
That's right.
And she was part of a group with her later-to-be husband, Percy Shelley. She became Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, and Lord Byron, who were the first intellectuals and were the first feminists of the 19th century.
So she was before Helen Keller or after?
Absolutely. She was before any of them. This is the point. This is the first wave of feminism in the 19th century. She went on at 17, wrote Frankenstein, in her 20s, became an avid feminist. Okay?
Wow.
Second wave comes in 1850. And I'm going to return to that because that's where I went. But 1850, all of a sudden, a bunch of scholars, European scholars, start to take the subject seriously. And I'm going to come back to one particular man. So it started in the 1850s. That led to the 1870s and 1880s of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stady Canton, and the fight for women's rights and the fight to try to get suffrage in the 1880s. Failed. Another black woman that comes into mind that people should know about is Ida B. Wells. She actually voted as a black woman
Right.
before white women did, because some states like Colorado, where I live, allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment. So some women did vote before 1920, and a black woman voted. But the first wave in the 20th century comes 1919, 1920, led by Alice Paul, who went on hunger strikes, and women get suffrage, the right to vote. So 1919, 1920, women get the right to vote, suffrage. In the 30s, women are gaining rights, but in the 40s and 50s, we go back again. Things go back, and the subject is forgotten. 60s and 70s, where I jump in, you have a strong wave of feminism. I'm going to mention many authors, many books. I'm going to mention a lot of titles, a lot of authors. People don't have to worry about writing it down and having to scramble to write. I will send you a reading list with everything I mentioned that you can share with people.
Wow,
And it's an extensive reading list. People don't realize how many people have written on this subject. Okay. So then in the 60s and 70s, and that's when I jump in. So when I started getting interested is because to give you a little bit about my background, because it's important. My father loved my mother very, very much. They both passed. He worshiped my mother because he worshiped his own mother. My father's mother died when he was young, in his 20s. And so he always said his mother was a saint. So he had a very healthy relationship with his mother and his sisters and with his wife. And he passed that on. It is important for men who have healthy.
What you're saying.
It's important for men and women to know that a lot of men have unhealthy attitudes, unhealthy relationships with women because of how the relationship they had with their mother.
Bingo.
And how their father related to their mother. So my brother and I have been very fortunate. We've had great relationships with women in our lives because of my father's attitude towards my mother. So I naturally leaned towards feminism in the 60s. And when it sprung around and I started reading people like Betty Friedan, Germaine Greer, these are titles people will know who are as old as I am, the feminists of the 60s and then the 70s. So I jumped in.
Right.
And I started to study it like I do, research it seriously. So then I got involved in the Women's Studies Department at San Jose State University, working on a second master's degree. And I got involved with a lot of young women anthropologists who were the feminists of the day. They were leading the way, and they were bringing back the subject, matriarchy. It was being ignored by the male professors in anthropology and archaeology. They brought back the subject. So I said, let me study the subject. So an author was named to me, a man's name. And again, I'm going to send you all of this written down so people don't have to scramble. J.J. Bachofen, Bachofen. He was Swiss. He was known as a Swiss jurist. He was a judge. He was a legal expert. His specialty in the 1840s was Roman law. He became the world expert at the time in Roman law. Now, what he noticed, the more that he studied Roman laws, the more laws he see that seemed to indicate that they were passing laws in opposition to a system that had been in place before. There were very strict Roman laws on inheritance from father to son, from males owning property, from males being in positions of authority. No woman could be in the Senate. The Greeks were the same, but the Greeks were not as bad as the Romans. The Romans were the ones who really established patriarchy. And they did it with a series of very strict laws. So the more Bachofen studied these laws, he said, there must have been a previous system where women were in a different status. And the more he studied the great mythology of the day and other literature of the day, he was convinced that there was a previous civilization that was matriarchal. So he wrote a classic book. The translation from the German is Myth, Religion, and Mother Right.
Wow.
He said civilization before had mother right, where mother was ruled.
You said Romans are, so that's the Catholicism aspect too, that religion.
Of course. Well, Catholicism was ruling Europe at the time. Islam was ruling Africa. And Judaism, it's already, patriarchy had already come well into established. That's why all the anthropologists were male until the 20th century. But he started to interest. Another Frenchman picked it up, and he went into a series of strong research in the 1880s. The man's name was Robert Briffaut. I will send you the name. He wrote this incredible 3-volume set called the mothers. Now, you know, this is the 1880s. There wasn't radio, there wasn't television, there wasn't computers. People read in those days, and they read huge books. One of his volumes was 1,800 pages. The third volume had a 900-page bibliography.
Oh my goodness.
This is the extensive research this man did.
Wow.
He influenced another man named Morgan, who wrote about matriarchy as he saw in Native American tribes. And in particular, he looked at one very important branch, which I can go on and on about, and I will a little bit. The people who called themselves the Haudenosaunee, who we called the Iroquois. They were the 5 nations, became the 6 nations. Morgan said they were matriarchal. They were matrilineal. And this is the reason why. Why this tribe becomes so important is 2 of our founding fathers, and one in particular, James Madison, was very enamored of this tribe and outlined our form of government, tripartite, legislative, executive, judicial, not after your English law, not after a European system, but a Native American system.
No, really?
The Haudenosaunee. Why? The Haudenosaunee had originally been matriarchal, but like every other civilization that we can talk about for the last 5,000 years, patriarchy came in. And they were led in for like the 13th century, 14th century, 15th century by male chiefs. And there were 5 separate tribes. That's why they called themselves the 5 nations. And they was fighting. Warfare. And this is a symbol of patriarchy. One of the aspects
Yes.
of patriarchy is systematic warfare, which
Exactly.
I'll tell about matriarchy and explain how matriarchy and patriarchy. So the women, the elder women of the 5 tribes got together and said, and pardon me, this shit's got to stop. We can't keep fighting these wars. We can't keep fighting the wars. We're going to stop it. And they stood up and they told them, we're taking over like it was before. And we're going to establish we're going to create a longhouse. In that longhouse, each one of the 5 tribes, the chiefs of the 5 tribes will choose representatives. Those representatives will go into the longhouse and they will make the rules, the legislative. Then we're going to have one chief. We're going to pick from the 5 nations, and he will be the chief. He will be symbolic. He will be just a placeholder. He will be just to agree with what everyone else says, but he has no real authority. But that's your executive. Then comes the most important part, the judicial. They would form the elders' ladies, called the clan mothers.
Right.
And they would be there sitting. They would look at the rules that the chiefs had made in the longhouse. If they said they were no good, they were thrown out. If the chief got out of line, did something they didn't agree with, he was out. Didn't need to.
13 grandmother concept?
That's where it comes from. That's where it comes from. It may have been 13. It may have been 9. We don't know. 9 wasn't the original Supreme Court. Our original Supreme Court was 4. It was raised to 9 by Franklin Roosevelt, who packed the Supreme Court in the 30s and brought it to 9. Some people want to go to 12 now, whatever. But it was only the women that decided. And James Madison looked at that system and he said, yes, that's the system. It's going to be the United States of
gives
America.
me chills.
Only he made a fatal mistake.
What?
The fatal mistake was they didn't allow the judicial clan mothers, because it's patriarchy. These were the founding fathers. The Supreme Court's only going to be men. There's not going to be any women in the Supreme Court. So then they made it that you had to have impeachment. How are we going to remove the official? He's got to be brought charges by the House of House of Representatives, then brought to the Senate, and they made a stupid fatal error saying it would take 3/4 of the senators to remove a president. And that's why we have not removed the president. And people don't know America.
How should it have been, you think, that would have been best?
That it should have been the judicial could remove anybody, could remove a congressman, could remove a president. The judicial in the Haudenosaunee system was the clan mothers, and the clan mothers were the final word. Matriarchy. Okay. So they made a mistake making it 3/4. We would have had one removed. Andrew Johnson, people don't know American history. We almost had. Andrew Johnson was a racist, sexist pig who was president because Ulysses S. Grant, because Abraham Lincoln wanted to balance out the ticket, so he took a Democrat from Tennessee, put him as his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who ruined, it's a long, long story, who ruined Reconstruction and all that. But they were going to remove him because he was totally corrupt. They bribed one Republican senator to vote for him, and he was one vote short of being thrown out of office.
Oh my gosh.
Now we had a Senate. Well, now we have a Senate of spineless Republicans. Forget it.
Right.
We weren't going to talk politics. Anyway, so there it goes. So that leads into the 20th century. So then you get a lot of women suddenly getting into academia in the 20th century, becoming anthropologists, becoming sociologists. That led all the way to the 1960s, when the women anthropologists were the forefront, the vanguard of the women's movement.
Wow.
So I discovered Bachofen. I discovered Defoe, Morgan. I kept going. Then there were some great authors that came in. Now I'm going to name a few. It's very interesting that the person who in academia who was most open to the idea of matriarchy was the great psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Jung. And a lot of the leaders in the field of matriarchy of these studies were his students. So I can name one man named Erich Neumann, wrote a book called The Great Mother. Boom, great book. And
while you're talking, I have chills just pouring down my body.
Because it's real.
Wow.
It's like,
oh my gosh.
At the end of the Hobbit, when Ariel has fallen in love with the Hobbit who's died, and she's crying and she's saying, "If this is love, take it from me. Why does it hurt so much?" And he says, "Because it's real."
Oh.
So
that's good.
Erich Neumann was a Jungian psychoanalyst. He wrote The Great Mother. Then there's the great mythologist Robert Graves, who wrote The White Goddess. These are all classics, classic books. They were reprinted in the 60s. That's why I'm bringing them out. I got to read all these books. They were reprinted from the original. Then there's a woman named M. Esther Harding. She was also a Jungian analyst. She wrote a book called Woman's Mysteries, covering it all. And the last one I want to bring to you, now in academia, but again, the women moved in the 60s and 70s. So there's a great lady who used to teach at UCLA, Marija Gimbutas. She wrote a book called The Witch Cult of Europe. She talked about the matriarchies in Europe. So it's all cultures that had matriarchies.
It goes back to Celtic and...
Absolutely. The Celts, the Druids were matriarchal.
I have Druid in my line.
All right,
okay,
great.
Keep going.
Okay, so then there was a series of great books that came out. Another Jungian, she became a psychiatrist, a woman named June Singer. She wrote a great book called Androgyny.
Wow.
We'll discuss that one. Another book, I met this woman because I became in women's studies, great lady, Merlin Stone, wrote a book called When God Was a Woman. Great book, highly recommended. Then came the one that impressed me the most. A lady named Barbara Lesko, who was a radical feminist in the late 70s. She wrote a powerful monograph called The Remarkable Women of Ancient Egypt. This was in 1977. In 1978, I got a master's degree from the Women's Studies Department, where I did a 5-hour oral presentation listing 5 for certain, 7, I believe, women who took the male role in Egypt.
Wow.
And became king. And so for 5 hours. And so the problem, I want to say Barbara Lesko, and I want to be right about it. She was a radical feminist in the late 70s when she wrote this monograph. She married an Egyptologist named Leonard Lesko. He obviously was very conservative, male-oriented, and he dampened down her feminism. But she wrote a great book in the field. She went on to teach at Brown University. She passed away in 2015. I'm sorry to say she never read my book, Land of Osiris, which I wish she had. But she's wrote a classic book called The Great Goddesses of Ancient Egypt. It is the most complete compendium of all what we call the feminine netters, which are mistakenly called goddesses. We'll explain why, because that's the basis of chematology. Wow. But she wrote the most extensive listing of all the different feminine netters there were, and she's wonderful. But she backs away from saying matriarchy. And this is 1996. She wrote this book, and she can't speak it because she's in academia, and she will be poo-pooed because she had a predecessor. I forgot one title that also influenced me greatly, so we're going back.
Yeah.
The first woman who got a PhD in Egyptology was Margaret Murray of Great Britain. She was beloved. She was actually in love with her teacher. She was a beloved student of the first great Egyptologist, Sir Matthew Windus Fletcher of Great Britain. Petrie was called the first archaeologist because he brought the scientific method into archaeology and Egyptology. She was his beloved student. She got a PhD in 1903. It would take many, many years before another woman got a PhD in Egyptology.
Right.
Almost till the 50s.
Right, I can imagine.
So she was alone. She was in the wilderness, but she saw, she knew, and she wrote a book in 1949. Hard to find. If someone wants to find it, you have to go through an extensive book search. I found it. I found a used copy called The Splendor That Was Egypt. And she's saying in 1949, Egypt was a matriarchy. The women were dominant. They ruled. They had rights and freedom that no other woman in the ancient world had. No Greek woman, no Roman woman, no Persian woman, etc. Because all the other cultures were extremely patriarchal. But Egypt, although, and this is what we can talk about, 3,000 years of recorded history, Egypt stayed matriarchal till the very end. The first ruler of a united Kemet, Kemet is the word we use, not Egypt, was a woman. The last ruler of ancient Egypt was a woman who took the title Cleopatra. Cleopatra the seventh. She was the seventh woman to take that title.
A lot of people don't know that.
Right. And she was the last ruler of the United Egypt. Starts with a woman, ends with a woman. So that's what led me into the whole path, and matriarchy was obvious. I saw many civils. I mean, we could go on and on. Before the Romans.
Is that just another language or another way of saying?
Okay. Let's start with the basics then, because you want me to go basic. Why we say Kemet, not Egypt? Egypt is a Greek word. It's based on a word called Egyptos, which is based on a contracted word, het ka petos.
Het ka petos.
But that actually is het ka peta, is the ancient term. I can send you a picture of Hakim pointing to it on a stele. That was only one site. It is where Memphis is today. It was het ka peta. Het means house, place. Ka is our etheric body, our double, our personality, our ego. And Ptah, let's say for now, was a male creator deity. So this is the place where Ptah manifested. That's all it means. It wasn't the whole civilization.
Right.
The Greeks called it Egyptos, Egyptos. So Egypt became the name of the country. No, the original term was Chem. Pronounced with most people can't pronounce it. It's the hard KH, like in German, ich bin. It's very popular in Arabic and Judaism. In Hebrew, you have the ch sound, chamos, chumush, chat, cha. So it's chem.
Chem.
Later, when they devised language and they devised masculine and feminine nouns, they put a T ending. The T was feminine for the land, so it became Kemet. And we pronounce it Kemet. Vowels were not written. Vowels were sacred. Like in anybody that's listening now that's Jewish, that knows the Hebrew language, knows that vowels are not written in Hebrew, they're sacred. It's the same thing in the Rosicrucian tradition. Vowels are to be chanted, I-E-A-O-U. Ah, ooh, that raises your vibration. It's sacred sound.
Right.
So they were not written. They were not written in the glyphs either. So we put them in.
Right.
So Hakim and I, when I met him and I saw that he had a system, I knew he had a system, I just put the title on it, Chematology. So we teach chematology, not Egyptology. Egyptology does not recognize the matriarchy at all, and it doesn't recognize the nest deck I'm going to tell you. The basis. We're going to start with the basis today. We can do another session and go deep into chematology. But here's the basis. Why I saw this and why I knew Hakim was my teacher, you understand? I'm discovering this in the late 70s and in the 80s. Okay, Kemet was a matriarchy. No doubt about it. And I'm writing about it. I wrote articles in David Hatcher Childress's World Explorer Journal in the 90s about it, about the Sphinx being female. This is what I will get into. So I'm led to believe that there's an ancient teaching. I got a lot of teachings in the 80s and the early 90s led me to believe that there were still ancient masters in Egypt, that there were still indigenous wisdom keepers who taught the old way.
You mean currently, current day?
Yes.
Wow.
And so in 1987, I took part in the San Francisco Whole Life Expo. This will be another subject for us to talk about. I was involved then as an archaeologist, as a metaphysic mystic. I'm leaving out. I'll talk more about my biography another time,
Okay.
how I got into mysticism, because that's ours in itself.
Okay.
But I learned that there was a man. I had got involved with crystal skulls. That's a whole other subject. I co-wrote a book with David Hatcher Childress. That's my third book on the subject. Crystal Skulls, Ancient Portals to Man's Past. I wrote half the book. David Childress wrote half the book. So I was involved this time with the Rosicrucian Order, and I was researching these things. So I was on a panel discussion about crystal skulls at San Francisco Life Expo. I saw that there was a group there, a travel agency, that was advertising themselves. It was called Power Places Tours. They were located out of Southern California at the time. A man named Dr. Toby Weiss and his wife, Terry Weiss, started this in the 80s. They started leading tours to Egypt for spirituality, for metaphysical reasons. They were the first American group to do so. Many famous people went with them, like Barbara Hand Clow, like John Anthony West. I could go on, like Greg Braden. A lot of great started leading tours in the 80s. Okay. I went over to this group and I started to talk to two wonderful people who were manning the group. A man named Harry Hover and his wife, she has passed, rest her soul, Dr. Ruth Hover. And I started talking with them. And at this time I had gotten into one of the alternative Egyptologists named Oriah de Lubitsch. I'll talk about him more in detail, but he was one of the great first alternatives. John Anthony West was the first great proponent of Schwaller's teachings. So we started talking to Schwaller. He said, oh, our leader, Toby Weiss, he's very into Schwaller's teachings. You should meet him. Oh, and I said, well, I'm really into the ancient ways. I'm not that big on Egyptology. So Harry Hogan said to me, you have to come with us. We have a guide that teaches the old ways. You should meet him. His name is Hakim.
Mm-hmm.
Hakim. The name went right into my soul. Hakim.
Old soul friend, you remembered.
I have to meet this man. This was 1987, 1990, skip ahead to 1992. I won't go into detail. I did not have the money to go. A series of miraculous events occurred, which is what happens, as you know. The money was there. I signed up. I went 3 weeks in Egypt. 2 weeks, I hooked in with a lady named Nikki Scully, who I should talk more in detail. She was leading many tours to Egypt at the time. She was leading a subgroup within the main group. I hooked in with her. She knew I had some knowledge. Oh, why don't you join us? Sure, sure. She used Hakim as her tour guide. So the first day I'm in Egypt, we go out on the Giza Plateau, and I have a photograph that it's on my Facebook page. I'll send it to you. Where we were, where he was standing. The first day I saw him, November 16th, 1992. That date is etched into my soul. I will never forget it. I'm there, and there he is, standing in front of his Sphinx. Now, to back up just a little bit, why I was led this way. As I told your husband, and as I know from you, people are called, but people are called at different times in their life. Sometimes we recognize it, sometimes we don't, and we don't act. And those that recognize it, they start on the path at a young age. Right. But we're all on the path. Right. That's why I said, when I worked for the Rosicrucian Order, we did not use the word psychic. We hated the word. We used the word sensitive, because we're all sensitive to different degrees. You have developed yours. Riz has developed his. I have too. Others don't. But everybody has that ability, that capacity. So I often point to a certain years. You know, we look back in our life, and I've been doing a lot of life journeying because I'm going to be 75 in December. So I'm looking back at my life now, and I'm seeing, yes, this person came in at this time, was very important. This happened to me at this age, that was very important. So around the age of 8, My mother, to her blessed memory, kept around the house the two great pictorial magazines of the day, Life magazine and National Geographic.
That's right.
I remember at the age of 8 picking up an issue of National Geographic, opening it up, and there was a photo of the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx.
Mm.
And I stopped. My jaw hit the floor, but at 8 years old, I could not articulate what was happening. I know now that the Sphinx made an unconscious connection with me.
Mm.
You once asked when we had a discussion, who was my activator? And I said I've had many spirit guides, but the first was the Sphinx.
Wow.
And she, I knew immediately, she spoke to me.
So does the Sphinx represent a certain like alien?
Hang on.
Really human?
No, hang on. No.
Okay, tell
We'll
me.
tell you who exactly she is.
Okay.
But she guided me. And okay, I say to people, that wasn't right away at 8 years old. I said, oh, I'm going to be an Egyptologist. I'm going to be an archaeologist. I'm going to find out everything there is to know. No. All I know is something happened to me. And then I started watching the science fiction movies. And I told you about the day the earth stood still, where I thought, okay, if there are aliens, they look like us, not like green men and monsters.
Right.
Okay. So I was open to that idea right away. She opened me to a lot of ideas. She opened me to everything Egypt. Every time I would see something Egyptian, I would, oh, that's important. Oh. Another important event, 1955. I was 9 years old. A movie came out called The Ten Commandments, directed by C.B. DeMille. I looked at that movie, and 9 years old, I said, this is wrong. The Egyptians were not like that. They were not cruel. They didn't have the Jews as slaves. This is all wrong. This is not right. This is not the true story. So I was born in Orthodox Judaism.
I felt that way about Mary Magdalene when I was 5 years old. I knew that story was incorrect.
Good for you.
I was 5.
Good for
I
you.
used to fight the Sunday school teacher.
Mary Magdalene was the patron saint of the Knights Templar.
Yeah. It's so funny the way they depict her, how they tried to bring her down and crash her into pieces.
Oh, it's much more.
Destroy her.
We'll give you the basis of that. Judaism is the basis of it. Okay. Yeah. So to let people know, I'm a second generation American. Both my parents are sons and daughters of immigrants. Both my grandparents, sets of grandparents, were Eastern European Jews who fled a great wave of anti-Semitism, which hit Europe in the late 19th century, 1870s, 1880s. Tremendous amount of Jews came to the US, especially from Russia, where anti-Semitism was at its height. And then again, there was another wave in the early 1900s. That's when my grandparents came. Okay. My father's father was an extremely Orthodox Jew. He went to synagogue, not just on the holidays, not just on Friday to Sabbath, every day. Every day. And he hardly spoke English. That's why I never had a connection with him. He died when I was about 10 years old. And he only spoke Yiddish most of the time, very little English. And I hated Yiddish because it was a language that my parents used to discuss with them things that they didn't want me to hear. So I hated it. Then I finally learned German when I was in college, and so I can understand Yiddish today. So there was so many million questions I wish I could have asked my grandfather.
Right.
But he was very religious. My father broke. My father's a first generation American. He went to rabbinical high school, but he decided not to become a rabbi. He wanted to lead a secular life. He got married, had children with my mother, and he went to synagogue. He became a conservative Jew. If people want to know Judaism, there's 3 branches: the Orthodox, the fundamentalists, and then in America, only in America, became 2 branches: conservatism and Reform. And Reform Judaism is the total liberal Judaism today, where even women can be rabbis, and the services are conducted in English. Conservative is still in Hebrew, with some English. Of course, Orthodox is all Hebrew, no English whatsoever. Okay. So my father was conservative, but he didn't push it on my brother and I. He allowed us to go. I broke. Like I say, this sort of 10 Commandments, right after I got bar mitzvah at 13, I said, no, Judaism is not providing the answers for me. What is the answers? Science. I fell in love with science, and I have 3 degrees in the sciences. Science is objective. Science will give me the truth. I went deep into science. So then I go into my academic career, and I realize science is another game. It's all that deals with the paradigms of science. It's really just another religion. So I said, no, And that's when I became the alternative researcher. And that's when I became an alternative researcher.
Boy, you really went down the rabbit hole young.
Oh, always. And
I
took it
wish
on
I
the
would have
chin.
known you back then. You would have.
Took it on the chin. I'm telling you. So I always argued with my professors. Always was arguing. Always was arguing.
Right.
And this is why I did not go into academia as a career, even though I have 2 master's degrees besides the BA. I was going to go for a PhD. I didn't get into the program I wanted, so I got a 2nd master's degree in women's studies, which led me to the Matriarchy. So after I'm out of there, I got involved with the Rosicrucian order. And so I got deep into metaphysics and mysticism through the Rosicrucians. And the Rosicrucians had also another different attitude about Egypt. They saw Egypt as great spiritual metaphysical basis. In fact, Egypt was the basis of all the medical systems, the Rosicrucians, the Masons, the Knights Templar, whatever, all kind of basis. And the Masons teach that. All the teachings come from Egypt. Rosicrucians teach that. All the teachings come from Egypt. In fact, the Rosicrucians teach their first traditional Grand Master was a particular Egyptian king.
Wow.
1968. I had just graduated from college. I didn't get accepted into the schools that I wanted to get into. And so I was faced with the draft. 1968, 67, 68 were the highest draft years of the Vietnam War. 2 weeks after I graduated, my 2S deferment became 1A. So I could be drafted into the Army and be sent to Vietnam. I had a choice to go to Canada, be a defector, and would be living in Western Canada today, or my brother who had been in the Air Force convinced me, go in the Air Force, you won't be in combat. So I joined the Air Force. If I had had a lady with me at that time who wanted to go to Canada with me, you'd be interviewing me today from Canada. You'd be interviewing me today from Toronto. But so I didn't. And I went in the Air Force and I spent those 4 years researching and doing things I hadn't had the chance to do during my academic career. So in 1968, I went into a great metaphysical bookstore in Lower Manhattan, one of the greatest bookstores in the world, Samuel H. Weiser Bookstore. They were once one of the great printing houses. I don't think they are anymore, but they printed Blavatsky, they prevented the Magnus text, they reprinted all the great old texts. Carl Jung tells this story about how you can go to a bookshelf looking for a specific book and another one will fall into your lap. And that was the book you were really looking for.
Right.
I was not looking for this book. I was looking for anything interesting.
Right.
And this book jumped out at me. A used paperback called Moses and Monotheism, posthumously published after the death of Sigmund Freud, written by Sigmund Freud, based on 3 articles he had written, first 2 in the early 30s for the psychoanalytic journal called Imago, I-M-A-G-O, out of Vienna. Freud was very interested in archaeology. The great archaeologists of his day were the German archaeologists. So a great German archaeologist named Richard Lipsius had discovered a city in Middle Egypt which no one had ever heard of before. It's today called Tel El Amarna. It's in its title, Achet Aten, the horizon of the atom. And he discovered an unknown king to Egyptology with the title Akhenaten.
What part of Egypt was it discovered?
It's Middle Egypt.
Middle. And
it's where the largest city near it is called El Minya, if people want to look on a map.
I was confused when I was there last because north is south and south is north.
Because that's how the Nile flows. She flows from south to north. Right. So their maps would have been reversed. South would have been on the top, north would have been at the bottom. But in ancient Kemet, there were no 2 Egypts. It was the Greeks who made Upper and Lower Egypt.
Okay.
It was only Kemet.
Okay.
So this book drove me nuts. Here he is talking about an Egyptian king who brought out the teachings that became Mosaic Judaism. That Moses was a priest of this particular king. That was Freud. Why did he do that? Because Lipsius had found the city. They found out all this information about this unknown king who had been attempted to be wiped out from history. I'm going to go into much more detail about this. Takes a whole session in itself. This is my 2nd book, From Light into Darkness, where there's about 3 or 4 chapters on Akhenaten, his connections to Judaism and the Rosicrucian order. And that's what I brought out unique among other people. But I became fascinated with this king. I had to know everything. I could read German. When I got into college, I studied German. So I read original source materials in German about it. The more I became, the more I'm obsessed.
You're like a decoder. You decode.
And well, the truth is, as I said to you, he was my spirit guide.
Yeah.
He is. Now, I could go on.
And how do you pronounce
I'm going to. Huh?
How do you
Okay, the time is about 1350 BCE, about 3,300 years ago.
How do you say his name?
Akhenaten.
Akhenaten. Okay.
He was when he was born, he was given the title Amenhotep, like his father.
The one with that very amazing face.
Yeah, which people think is alien, right? People think he's an alien. There has a man has written a book called Akhenaten, the Extraterrestrial King. It came out in the 70s.
I think I've heard of that book.
Right, Daniel Blair Stewart, where he claims he was from the beings from Sirius. We can't do this all today. This will be too much. This is another session. Okay. Right. But this is what led me into the field. Right. So that's what led me. Akhenaten, Egyptology, 1968, that became my life's work. The Sphinx had been leading me all this time, but when she led me to this book, and I know she led me to this book, then it became my life. So I'm obsessed about this king. Nothing else is important to me but study. So then I went on a whole self-study of Egyptology. I had gotten my second master's. So I was living in San Jose, doing different things to survive, which we don't have to get into. And I spent hours in the stacks, the library stacks at the San Jose State Library, reading every book in Egyptology I could. All the masters, from Petrie, who started, Breasted, Gardner. People who know Egyptology will know these names. I read all of them, up until those that wrote about Akhenaten, Arthur Weigall, others who were writing books. A Canadian Egyptologist named Daniel Redford wrote a book on Akhenaten. And I decided that their books were all wrong. It was coming to me that they did not have this picture. This was going to be my life's work. Okay. Then I went ahead. The 70s I was doing this. The 80s I was doing it. In the 70s, I discovered Eric Van Donigen, as I told you. And it interested me, and I got deep into the extraterrestrial ET thing until I started to do archaeology in the south of France in 1974. And I was trained by one of the world's great prehistorians of the 20th century, Professor Francois Borde of the University of Bordeaux, who not only was one of the world's great archaeologists, but he was a geologist and taught me geology too. And I love geology. Geology is essential to any archaeologist. Stratigraphy, learning things in layers and patterns. So then it led me to San Jose State, women's studies, women in ancient Egypt. I saw the Matriarchy. I wrote about it, wrote articles about it. So skip on ahead then to 1992. In the 1880s, I discovered Zechariah Sitchin. Right. And I got into the Anunnaki. But I met him in 1992. And I had a full day session with him. And as I've already said to you, and I'll say it publicly, I found him very lacking.
Yeah.
There was not a spiritual bone in his body. Like Van Donigen, and like a lot of people who started the UFO studies, only interested in nuts and bolts, the saucers and the physical beings, only the physical ET, only the physical beings and the nuts and bolts.
Which is so weird, since everything's metaphysical and quantum.
But they're not. Most of these people are hard-nosed not. Most science fiction writers are not into spirituality at all. It's all just nuts and bolts and technology.
Right.
Okay. So then I met the people at Power Places Tour, 1992, this miracle Ken. I go to Egypt. There he is. Now, this is why. We return to this spot.
I bet he loves the way you tell this story, because he's passed on.
Yes.
So he listens.
I'll tell you how I told the story.
To you.
I tell you how I tell the story when he was alive, because I gave this lecture with him in the audience. So listen to how I tell it. And he loved it. He loved it. If you go on my Facebook page, I will send you the pic. People want to know, what's the best picture you have of you and Hakeem? It's us together laughing at a joke together. Because as I told you,
were you guys both sitting down? Were you sitting?
Yes.
That one stood out to me. I saw that.
That's in 2004. We were in front of a group answering questions. I made a joke. He turned to me and laughed, and somebody beautifully caught that picture. Because if anybody claims to be a master or a guru or an enlightened being, and they don't make you laugh, and they don't make jokes at their own expense, they're not self-effacing like I can be, like I know Mirza is, then they're not a true master.
That is what I've been telling everybody. If you're not having fun and laughing and having humor, Something's missing.
Rajneesh, who I told I was very much into Rajneesh, he used to talk about the Buddha.
Yeah.
Gautam Siddhartha, who was the Buddha, Gautam Buddha. The last words Buddha said to his disciples, be a light unto yourself.
Mm.
And he left. Rajneesh gathered all his disciples around him. And he was the great jokester. He would tell the most obscene, dirty jokes. He was an incredible comedian. He turned to all of them and he said, be a joke unto yourself. And he left.
Mm-hmm.
So he's standing in front of the Sphinx and he starts talking. Now, I sent you a tape of him. A lot of people go into alternate states just hearing him talk. I did. I went into an altered state as soon as he started talking. And I looked at the Sphinx. And this is how I tell the story. And I told it when he was alive and he loved it. I would look at her and I would look at him. I would look at her and I would look at him. And I couldn't tell who was older. Because he had this face of 1,000,000 years of wisdom in his face. And he would laugh when I would tell the story. And she said to me, quite clearly, as any message I've ever gotten in my life, here is your master. Here is your teacher. Here is the man you've been looking for all your life. He is my son.
Mm.
And I looked at him, and as soon as he came back to myself, he started talking about it. And he said, pointing over his shoulder, and she is 54,000 years old. And I said, this is my man. This is my man.
Opposite of everything you've heard.
Every minute of the tour, every minute of the 3 weeks that I could spend with him, you can see video, because people shot video of this, that he's walking and I'm right next to him. You can see us on tour together, because we did a tour in 2007, another tour in 98. It was videoed. You could see me right next to him. He's always leading the tour group. He's in the front, of course, and I'm always right next to him. Every second I spent with this man was precious.
Mm.
So he then said to me, I got to talk to him. I pulled him on the side. We went to the museum. The museum was where he revealed himself. He started talking to me. He would say things like, and my masters taught me that. I said, wait a minute. This man is not Muslim. Okay. Your master said this. And then he would always point to the women. And the women were most important. And the women were the rulers. And the women were, I said, oh, this is my man. And I said to him afterward, I said, I've been searching for groups that keep the old wisdom here. Some people say they're called the Ammonites. Are you one? And he said, yes. How did you know? I said, I read a book by Murray Hope, another book. I recommend this book highly. Ancient Egypt, The Sirius Connection by Murray Hope. Great channel. Oh. She channeled in the Pashats, the lion beings from Sirius that were not human. They were leonine beings, intelligent, bipedal lion creatures who were intelligent, like reptiles. We're going too far into it. But anyway.
Yeah,
but Murray Hope was the one who talked about this. And so I said, oh, yes. I found out he was not an Ammonite. He would be called an Atenite, a follower of Akhenaten. But he said, you come back to Egypt. You stay with me. You study with me. It wasn't until 5 years later that I finally got the money together to go back. And I spent 3 weeks with him in 1997. That 3 weeks became my book, The Land of Osiris.
Mm.
Why the Sphinx? I'll tell you that because it's important.
Mm.
He would tell the story because he's an indigenous wisdom keeper. He was an academic, and then he had dual degrees in Egyptology and archaeology. He did graduate work at Leiden University in Holland in archaeology. So he was academically trained, but he went the other way. When he was a young boy, he went all over Egypt, sought out the people at each site, who they called the keepers, and asked them what's important. And they would show him where the energy was at the site, what the netters really meant. And so he formulated this system. So he had gotten this story from the indigenous tradition, which had been passed.
People don't understand. Can you explain how wisdom teaching works? Because it's
okay. Well, just for example, we learn by writing, right? We learn by reading books. Mm-hmm. Well, duh. Mm-hmm. Writing is only 6,000.
I thought I was the only one still saying duh.
Writing is only 6,000 years old, according to academia.
Do you guys see why I sought him out and like made him? He talks like me in that way. Okay, go ahead.
You're a hippie who was born later than. So you and Riz were hippies that were born 20 years
Truly.
later. That's all. Okay.
So,
Yeah, so he would say this story came down, the indigenous story. Okay, we learned by books. Academia tells writing began 4,000 BC in Sumer. Nonsense. Writing began in Kemet 6,000 BCE, 8,000 years ago with the glyphs. What Sumer is, what the Sumerian cuneiform is just a shorthand of the glyphs. The glyphs were the first written language. It goes back to 8,000 BCE. So 10,000 years we've been writing. That's all. What did we do before then? We talked to like we're doing now. Exactly. We share information. The oral tradition goes back millennia.
So information was very valuable back then.
That's how we started. That's how we became human. How we became human is by being social groups. This idea of a nuclear family, a man, woman, and child, is only in the last couple hundred years. It's a patriarchal mythology. We were raised in tribes. We were raised in groups. We had many mothers and fathers. We always were raised in groups. And that's how knowledge was passed down. Goes back to Neanderthal, goes back to early Homo sapien. They would sit around the campfires at night, eat a good cooked meal, and then the elders would speak, and everybody would listen. And they would tell the stories of the tribe, going back millennia.
So the elderly would be speaking to the young ones, the ones
mainly the women. Mainly the women were the wisdom keepers. So he learned from the wisdom keepers, and this is the story he learned. The only deity that was known to the very ancient Cometians, we're talking over 10,000 years ago. There was no God. There was no kings. There was no religion. They only knew the Great Mother. That's all. Created everything. In fact, they said the Great Mother creates all that there. It controls that which is created and that which is uncreated. See, you see aspects of it today. Again, this is why Barbara Lesko's book is so great. Maria Gimbutas' book about the witch god, the goddesses of Europe. She's there. Kali can take you in, bring you out. It's the same with Isis. She came, but the first was called Nut. N-U-T.
That's the root of mother, correct?
And you can tell when somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, as somebody who gave a presentation at a conference in Egypt I was at one time, when they say nut.
No, it's
no. The U in ancient language is always nut. Okay, so the story is, she's not manifested. When Nut decided she wanted to be in physical form on the earth, she spit. And that spit became the Sphinx. And she's known as Tef Nut. Tef in the ancient language meant moisture, humidity, but it meant saliva. Now here's the key. Why spit, I would say, Papa? Why saliva? Why spit? Why did she spit? Because we'll use the scientific term. When we expectorate, it has no mass, no volume. It can't be weighed. It can't be measured. So the Great Mother is saying, okay, if you want to have an image of me, I'll give it to you. But you can't define me. That's why she's always had the veil. That's why only those of us who can lift the veil behind the Sphinx know the truth about matriarchy and the truth about the Great Mother. So she was the Alpha and the Omega. Before anything else, 54,000 years ago, they carved her face.
That makes sense. Just where I live, the Chumash Native American, this is their land, and they were here.
They were matriarchal. A lot of California Indians were matriarchal.
Yes. 9,000 years. That's an entire civilization.
There's the great tribe, let me think, that would make baskets out of feathers, bird feathers. The
Hopi?
No, California tribe.
Oh,
It'll come to me. They made the most incredible baskets out of bird feathers.
really?
You look at images of the California Indians when they came to California in the 19th century. They were the original hippies. The men had hair down to their asses,
I love
not just down to their shoulders. They didn't practice warfare. They were matriarchal. They were not hunters. They were fisher people.
Do you
They
notice they
fished.
look androgynous? They look very feminine.
Do you know that Native Americans had 5 sexes, not just 2 like we do? 5 different
They were
determinations. They would talk about the 2 spirits. They called gay people were told there was no LGBTQ among Native Americans. Everybody was accepted to who you wanted to be. And so was the way in Kemet. I'll tell that story next time. Kemet, we got so much more to talk about. So.
Well, you know, I want to do an episode on women's sexuality.
That also comes from Kemet. So we'll come from there.
That's a big deal because the shame.
Of course. Well, we can discuss that now. We can discuss that now because we're not done. We can stay for a while.
Sure.
I can go for a little bit longer, but then we can do more sessions. So that's what there it is. She was the Alpha and the Omega. Hakim would say, before it was even carved, there's a natural limestone outcropping that came on the plateau, which geologists call a yardang. And they would come to this site 56,000 years ago just to energize themselves. This is when he would tell me, the site dictates what's there. What's at a site is according to the energy of the site. So then he would tell me, at each site, there has to be 3 important things. Underground running water. What we call igneous rock, which is granite, diorite, travertine, which is full of crystal, and a natural source of crystal. The running water with the crystalline rock, with the crystal, creates natural electromagnetic fields. This is what we feel at the sites. This is why Native Americans, again, and every indigenous culture built their temples, built their places of worship on a sacred site, which we would call a power place, which we would call a zone today, a power point, place of energy. It's because that's where a ley line, exactly. So Hakim learned that. He understood that. And he told me you have to search for these 3 things. And the Commission civilization is all laid out on a grid line of natural water, underground tunnels. What he told me first, before you study anything above ground, is we're going to go underneath the Giza Plateau. And we did. And we went into the tunnels. The tunnels that think Egyptologists carved for tombs. Nonsense. They are not for tombs. They are originally water tunnels. And they may go as far as 50 to 100 miles out into the desert where the original Nile River was. This is all in my first book, Land of Osiris.
So
they brought the water. They brought the water.
So that's why when I was walking down those tunnels, they were oddly shaped like humans wouldn't want to walk down that kind of inclination or
I swam, Hakim swam in them. There's a great story that he told when he was 17 years old. He's at the site of Saqqara. Saqqara, now I'm going to get to the basis before we leave. Saqqara is 10 kilometers away from Giza, 8 miles. He was at Saqqara, he found a tunnel, and he went down. Ended in water. He said, he would always say, me being me, 17 years old, I was a little wild. He dove in, he swam, he came out on land, he crawled, he dove in again, he swam, he walked, he swam. He came out on the Giza Plateau right behind the Sphinx. 8 miles. That's how they were connected. And
yeah, because when I went to the Sphinx, there's this big area around it that's blocked off, like it looks.
Zahir Was was doing that for years, blocking off all the tunnels, blocking off the evidence of the ancient civilization. Okay, let's start with basis. I'll give you the basis of chematology. This will lead us to a much more involved discussion. So how he established something was because of number 5. 5 was a key number to the Commissions. They did a lot of things around 5. Also, the number 42, very important number. Why? Hakim said the original Commission civilization was based on 42 tribes. That's why there are 42 main letters. There are 42 what they called nomes. The Egyptologists will talk about Upper and Lower Egypt were divided into 42 geographical areas called nomes, N-O-M-E, geographical areas. Well, they don't say each one had a netter, each one had a divine principle because they were the originals. So 5 pers. Per, P-E-R, we use P-R, is the Egyptian, the glyph. I'll show you the glyph. It's like a square. It meant house. There were 5 houses. Okay, we would start. The first house was Per-Ah, the high house. Guess which word is derived from Per-Ah? Pharaoh. The Greeks saw the term. First of all, the Hebrews came in. They saw Per-Ah, and they made it the Hebrew word Per-O. The Greeks saw it, said Pharaoh. But they only saw, because they were patriarchal, the males. They saw the figures on the walls. Oh, the Pharaoh must be the male king. No. Here we start basically where your matriarchy comes in, sweetheart. From the beginning, everyone has used the word wrong, including myself. There were no male pharaohs. Period. End of discussion. Per-Ah was the high house. It was the woman's house. Descent went from mother to daughter. She was always the Per-Ah, who she chose to be her consort. And there was no word in their language for marriage. There was no word in their language for wife. There was no word in their language for husband. There was no word in their language for son. It was what we say consort, who she chose to be her consort. That person was known as the Horus Rising. The Horus, the male head of the family. He's the one that everybody looks at and says that was the king, that was the ruler, and they have dynasty after dynasty. She was the Per-Ah from the beginning, from the first to the last.
And
Now,
how did they?
Sphinx, let me continue. The Sphinx today is not the original face. It is the face today of a black African woman. It is not a man's face. In the very early times of historical period, there was a particular ruler who venerated his mother very much. His mother was a black African queen, we'll say, leader of northern tribes. There was war going on between the north and the south. She chose a male from the south to end the warfare. That became the United Kingdom. That's how Egypt became a united land. Never from a conquest, never from a male king deciding this is going to be the country. It was from a woman who took a man as her consort, and it became a united kingdom. And so then her son, to venerate her, recarved the face of the Sphinx as it is today. And I can even tell you her title was Neet-Hotep, the one who sacrifices to the goddess Neet. Neet was a very ancient mother goddess of Africa. But it was carved many times. It's not the original head. The head is out of proportion to the body. I'll send you a video I did in 2016 by the Sphinx from Satyen Raja's group video.
Yeah, we'll put it
and
a link in the.
I'll send it to you after this, and it tells the details of the history of the Sphinx, how she is today. But she's at least, he would say, 54,000 years old. And then he would turn to the audience and say, someone proved me wrong. And now we have a geological marker. We had Robert Schoch, who came to Egypt with John Anthony West, great geologist. He looked at the Sphinx and said, oh no, this is not wind and sand. This is water erosion. Water erosion hasn't rained in Egypt in 8,000 years in the Giza Plateau. Significantly do that. So she must be older than 8,000 years. And Schoch put his academic reputation on the line and said, she's not dynastic. That's not a male king. It has to be pre-dynastic, has to be older than that. Today he knows that we go back. There's a geological marker we use, and I say this in the video so people will be able to see it, we'll be talking about it right on site. 30,000 years ago, there was a geological event. It's called the Mousterian Pluvial. I say subpluvial on the video. That's the only mistake I make. Pluvial, they can look it up. It occurred around 30,000 years ago. Severe rainfall all through Europe, Northern Africa. So Schoch said the kind of rain damage that's done to the Sphinx could not have happened from a flash rainstorm, from a flash flood. It had to be thousands of years of rain beating it. It has this particular rolling, you'll see when I'm in the aloe, this particular rolling erosion in the limestone can only occur by water because limestone falls under the ocean. It forms under the ocean.
They start using limestone.
They, We can recognize ancient Kemet as far as dynastic, according to the geology, according to the stone used. How you recognize ancient Kemet is you see igneous rock, or what is called plutonic rock, which is the hardest stone on our planet. Granite, diorite, basalt, and alabaster travertine are the famous favorite stones of the ancients. So wherever we see that, we know this is not dynastic. The dynastic people came and appropriated. You see, the Cometians were the most conservative of people. They never threw anything away. You have a temple, that temple collapses, you take the stones from that temple as seeds, because the temple is considered to be a living organism. So you take the seed from that temple, and they're the foundation stones of a new temple. So the old temple grows the new temple. The Masons do that. The Masons took that today. When they build a Masonic temple, they take a stone from an old temple. So it's directly from Kemet. So they later had an abundance of limestone all over Egypt. So limestone became a favorite stone too. But how you tell the difference between dynastic and pre-dynastic is all the temples in the south, which are dynastic that you went to, Abydos, Edfu, Dedara, Philae, are all sandstone. With little exception, some sandstone is very soft stone.
Yeah.
Very, very easy to carve.
Roads.
So when you see a granite statue, even though the cartouche may say Ramses II, the statue is thousands of years older than Ramses. The priest just came along and put the cartouche in there.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, reappropriate. That's why the Egyptologists don't understand what they're looking at. They don't know how to pull back the layers. I would tell people being in the field with Hakim was like him peeling away the layers of an onion. You'd peel away the Islamic Muslim layer, which is the top layer. Underneath is a Coptic Christian layer. Underneath is a Roman layer. Underneath is a Jewish layer, which not even Egyptologists know about. Underneath is a Greek layer. Underneath is an Assyrian layer. Underneath is a Persian layer. Then you get the dynastic layers. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom,
You know,
New Kingdom, and underneath that is ancient Kemet.
I told everybody that I've been mentioning this interview, I said, you know, for us to understand who we are today, you have to understand the truth of our civilization, or the beginnings of our civilization. You have to, because imagine if this was headline news. Imagine if this was the book that all the kids were learning in school. Imagine what would happen to our kids if we learned.
Imagine if every girl on this planet, as soon as she comes to consciousness, to know that women were once the totally worshipped and respected, that there was no sexism, that there was no such thing as women's work, men's work, that a little girl was never told, you can't do this, you can't do that. Okay, I'm going to give you the story because I usually wait, but I'm going to tell you how it was in ancient Kemet. Again, there were no gods, there was no religion, there was no this, there was no that. A child, when born, there was only one relationship, mother and child. The child was called the Ach. That's why his name Ach and Aten meant the spirit or the reflection. Hakim said it meant the shadow of, because the child is the shadow of the mama. She can't go. She goes, she can't get rid of her shadow. It follows her everywhere. The classic, of course, is what they use, ducks, geese, ducks, because they imprint on their mother immediately and they follow mama everywhere. Mama walks across the pond, the ducklings go. And a duckling will imprint on the first thing that mothers it. It could be a human being, it can be a sock, it could be a rubber ball. The first thing that a baby duck gets nourishment from, it will imprint that it's mother. That's basic knowledge. Cat, that's why I love cats so much. Why the Cometians loved cats so much. The cats are the most matriarchal of species. They always orient to the female. I'm a cat dad. My cats love me, but they follow mama everywhere.
She's sleeping on my bed on my side.
Well, I can't show you mine because she's feral. She won't come and let you see her. She only is to my wife, and she's Cleopatra. She's the queen of the Nile. She's the boss. I have a little thing on our table where we eat. It says, "We just live here. The cats are in charge."
It's true.
Nobody venerated cats more than the Cometians did. Nobody. That's why there's so many cat netters, so many lion netters, sek net. I would go on. We'll talk about the netters in detail. But here it is. A child is born. The children of Kemet, male or female, didn't matter of your plumbing. They all ran around naked, and they had their hair in a side lock. You can see that if you look at images of dynastic Egypt, you can see the children are portrayed that way, wearing all the hair in the sidelock. For their first 7 years, they're subject to mama's house, mama's rules, mama's laws. But listen to this, at the age of 8, child comes to mama. And what was the child called? The name that the child was called for the first 7 years is the first sound it makes upon birth. So in other words, children were born consciously. The wife was, mama was still conscious. She wasn't sedated. The midwives were all Hathor priestesses. The first noise the child made, that vowel, would be incorporated in what its name would be. Male or female, doesn't make a difference. Doesn't make a difference. At the time of the 8, child comes to mama and says, Mama, I'm not going to follow your rules anymore. I'm going out in the world, and this is what I want to do. This is what I want to be. And this is what I'm going to be called.
And how old are they?
This is my name. 8. 8, they were considered adults. Understand that. So then mama goes. Hakeem would do this. Demonstrate. Hakeem would go. Mama goes. My job is done. Go in peace.
And we do that now at 18.
Not even 21. It was 21 for the longest time. Even people weren't considered adults in their 20s for the longest time. Right. Believe me. Okay. So there's no one that tells that child, oh no, you can't do that because you're a girl. Oh no, you can't do that because you're a boy. The greatest cooks are men. The greatest seamstresses were men because they were taught by women.
That's true.
My uncle, my grandfather, my mother's father was a tailor. He was incredible.
Fashion designers.
So, and that's how life was. There were no rules. There was no God. People couldn't. What was matriarchy? Matriarchy, like patriarchy? No, because there were no gods. There were no wars. There was no hierarchy. But then it's, oh, then men were inferior. No, every man understood his maleness. Every male was venerated. No one was considered lesser. The only significance was, who was your mother? Who was your mother's child? Tribe. The only hierarchy was the tribe, the status of your tribe. So that's why when they conquered, the tribes that conquered, they became the ruling class. They were the ruling tribe. Then, as we move into patriarchy, you then form hierarchy. The ruling tribe is on top, everybody else was down below. But what we know is that ancient Kemet, and especially in dynastic times, was an incredibly upwardly mobile society. People could come from poverty, become the ruling class, and become king. Which we think only the United States today can supposedly come from the poor and become the king. No, that was the norm.
You know what's really interesting is the ones that are oppressed in our current civilization, which are dark-skinned people and women primarily, right, over time. Right. Those were the beginning factions. That was the beginning of our roots. And yet, look at
So you think it's an accident? You think it's an accident? You think it's an accident? And this is why Bachoven see the Roman. Why do we have so many prohibitions about girls in this society? You can't do this. Judaism starts it. Christianity builds it higher. Islam takes it to the highest degree. Women are inferior. Women are lesser. Do you know? Maybe I shouldn't go there. We're going to end soon. Do you know in this?
Well, you can end on that.
Do you know that in marriage in Islam there's no rape? That a husband can rape his wife?
Oh yeah, I do know that.
It's in the Quran.
Right. Well, isn't there like a sheet and then a hole in the sheet?
Well,
something.
If the woman doesn't give herself to the man, he can take her. That's what it says in Quran. Right. And in Judaism, why did I reject Judaism? About 14 years old, I came to my father. And I said, there's a prayer that every Orthodox Jew say every morning. I can't say this prayer, but what? Every Orthodox male Jew prays in the morning to his male God, thanking him for not making him a woman. Did you know that?
No.
People who are not non-Orthodox Jews don't know that. That Orthodox Jew thanks his male buddy every day for not making him a woman. But in ancient Kemet, I'll tell you more when we get on. We're going to go deeper. Do you know
how many places this can go?
Exactly.
It branches. It just keeps branching. You could find it everywhere.
But now you understand the basis of Kemetology is it was a matriarch.
Okay, I'm going to leave on this note. I have to have this one little political question.
Sure.
So how do you feel about Biden's pick?
Historic. It just so happens in this last 2 years, I've learned more about American history than I ever knew before. African American history, the Reconstruction period, the period from 1865 to now, to 1920, to then to now. White Americans don't know the history. So I say Kamala Harris is the natural ancestor of Harriet Tubman, of Sojourner Truth, of Ida B. Wells. People need to know those three names. There's a great film out now. You can see it on pay-per-view for free. Harriet. The film they just made about Harriet Tubman is very historically accurate.
Yeah, I loved it.
Kamala Harris is standing where Harriet Tubman should have stood.
It's true.
You want to know the first black woman who could have been president? Ida B. Wells. Google her, learn about her.
Well,
she was before Rosa Parks. In
yeah,
the 1880s, she got on a Pullman train and she went to the white car and she refused to leave. And they threw her off the train. What did she do? She became the first black millionaire and she bought the company. And
you don't hear about that in your everyday history books.
Ida B. Wells stood with Frederick Douglass as the greatest leader, black African leader, ex-slaves.
Well, the first thing I do when people come work with me long-term as a shaman is they start working with me and I give them their homework assignments. And one of the homework assignments I give them is they have to watch all of the slave movies.
Right.
They can't do any work with me until they understand who they are, where they're at, and get perspective. If you're going to talk to me from white privilege and arrogance, I'm not listening. So we're just going to start from there and work our way up.
Right.
You know?
Very good.
Yeah.
And read the writings of Ida B. Wells, because she wrote extensively, and Frederick Douglass. Absolutely.
Well, this reading list is incredible.
Yes.
It's just diamonds and gold. So you're going to provide
and the interesting thing is I have not seen a lot of volumes in the last 20 or 30 years who've added to the pile. I mean, again, like I said, without getting politics, but things changed in the 80s. America went very conservative. All the gains of the 60s and 70s went down the drain in the 80s and 90s, and academia went very conservative. So I would be very surprised. I'd love to hear from some people that you may know. If there anybody out there, 20-year-old female anthropology students, please let me know if they're teaching matriarchy, if they're mentioning any of these labels, if they're mentioning Mirza Gimjupats, who was a PhD in anthropology, who wrote about the matriarchal witchcraft cults of Europe. I don't see it. When I look at the new volumes that are put out, I don't see books written about matriarchy by young women. I don't see it.
No, definitely it's not coming from that place. I mean, we're lucky if we get books just on how to be empowered and how to take what you have now and try to turn. That was one of the reasons why this was so important for me, is I wanted to blast a hole through the mountain and show people what's really actually happening.
Yep.
And once you get this information, it reminds you, like, I'm reactivated. I'm totally rewiring myself into my ancient history and my DNA. And I know I've been many things in many lifetimes. I know I've been male and female, and I chose female this in particular, this ride. And I want to really understand why I chose to be female. Internally, I feel very male. I have a lot of male orientation. I have 5 children. I'm very go-getter, and
I'd have to see your astrology chart to know more detail about that.
Yeah, I'm a Taurus. I'm a Taurus Leo.
You have Aries. You probably have Aries in there. Aries women are the most male of women, most masculine, most aggressive, most assertive. Well, this is how. Look, this is beautiful. You just led me to another Hakim teaching. I want to bring this out. We're talking about that. Hakim would always use his mother as the example of him because he idolized his mother. His mother was such a powerful symbol. So when he would talk about this, he would say, my mother, she's 51% feminine, 49% masculine. Me, I'm 51% masculine, 49% feminine. So the only difference is 1%. That's the plumbing and that's the hormones. But the rest We are the same. Men have androgens. Women have testosterone. It's all there in different
in your
degrees.
experience, do you think women carry more of the assertiveness or that male energy they talk about, and men are more in the feminine?
Well, it's suppressed. Yeah, I mean, that's how we are at birth. Men are taught you don't cry, you don't show your emotions, don't talk about your feelings. And women are taught, you know, you don't be intellectual, don't be assertive, blah, blah, blah. So it's suppressed at birth. That's what, if you remember in my interview with Sachin, that's what he said, that Hakim had told him. From birth, we're given these labels. Oh, you're a girl. That means you got to have pink, you got to go this, you have to wear a dress, you can't do sports or this and that. You know, that's changed over the years, but it's still there. We're damped down at birth. If we're allowed to be, then we have the 5 sexes of the Native Americans.
Well, at a certain point in elementary school, we start splitting into those hormone changes and then labels, right? But up until then, we think we're the same, right? So that's beautiful. But,
and what happens is, if you notice, girls always mature faster than boys.
Right.
Girls
Which
in
is going to
public
lead me
school.
to tell you, my observation of male and female dynamics is, and I've been very engrossed in those because I'm very social. So what I've noticed is men tend to be more sensitive than women. I notice that us women, we know how we are. So we actually have more like respect and fear for each other because we're more deadly than men. Men are not as deadly to us as we are to each other. So we understand how powerful we are.
That's Kali.
Yeah, it is definitely Kali. And then I see men are forced into this. They're like pushed to the front lines of war. They're forced to be aggressive. They're forced to be macho. They have to come out like swinging. And most men are just suffering in repression from being
you're right. You're very that's a great psychological observation. We're forced into these roles. But this is why women are so battered. Women are so damaged today.
Yeah, because men are
because of that.
Because they're not allowed to be sensitive.
And because because men are taught that you have to suppress a woman. You have to beat her up. Muslim men are taught that they have to beat their wives or their wives don't respect them. Respect them by being your ass kicked? Give me a break. Respect by loving the person. No, the men that are sensitive today have been forced to bring out that part of themselves, have been forced to deal with that part, to feel with their sensitivity, and to allow it to be open and free, and to be open to that part of themselves. Women have to be open to the fact that they can be assertive, aggressive, ambitious.
And we were allowed to have more expression as, you know, being girls, we were allowed to share more. And
only in the last 50 years, girlfriend. You don't know what it was like for your grandmothers and your great-grandmothers.
Well, yeah, children were supposed to be silent. You're not even
women were supposed to be silent.
Yeah.
Women could only talk in women's groups.
My mom is from Honduras, and they don't even look at girls as human. I mean, you are
That's Catholic. That's Catholic. That's Christianity. That's Catholicism. Indigenous people in South America didn't think that way. The Maya didn't think that way. The ancient peoples didn't think that way. This is Christianity. This is patriarchy. So then we say to people, understand that we're talking about cycles. We'll talk about cycles even more the next trip, but we're in the low end of the cycle now. Patriarchal has been the ruling function for 5,000 plus years.
What did you think when all the women around the world stood up in protest against Trump?
Oh, are you kidding? I was there marching. My wife and I were in Denver walking with 100,000 people.
What was going through your mind? What were you thinking about?
I loved it. There was one little girl was there. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, had a sign girl power. Her mother had a sign woman power. Her grandmother had a sign grandma power. There were 3 generations marching together. I thought that was unbelievable.
Well, that's one good thing Trump brought is women got together finally. I think we finally had enough, and I think finally we agreed as a whole that it's time to rise and stand up.
That's why white people are out in the
great
streets.
Uprising, and they say that, you know, in the beginning it was just the women were rising. Obviously, both male and female are having a rising, but that's going to be for the next our next session, because what I'd like to talk about is how there's been many waves and cycles of uprisings, of awakenings, of ascension that we have had in the human race.
Well, we're going to talk Kemet.
We'll do that next time.
We're going to talk in detail about all the cycles and about all the history of Kemet and how it's come to the modern time. Because we'll talk about cycles. And
we just
particularly
need to
the last 2.
We just have to keep educating. And that's what it comes down to.
That's one thing
I'm technically supposed to be like an academic teacher. I never went down that road. I was busy having kids. But I ended up being a teacher, you know.
Absolutely. We are born, there are those that are born to be teachers.
Yeah, I can't help myself.
To his last breath.
Nobody can shut me up.
To his last breath, Hakeem was still teaching, and I will too.
I mean, if you like it or not, I'm so sorry. I just can't help it.
Knowledge can't be kept to oneself.
You have to. You have to keep
a
rising the consciousness. You have to. So thank you so much. Can I call you Stephen?
Absolutely.
Oh my God, that's my dad's name. For everybody, my dad is Stephen Miller. He is Stephen Mehler.
That's pretty amazing.
So my dad would have been.
There's only one letter that separates us. Only one letter.
My dad would have been his age, and he died when he was 54. So
and we'll talk about this again with maybe some people. But he followed Gene Scott.
He did. I can't even believe you know who Gene Scott is.
You have to understand that when you said that, that's what made me know that I have to talk to you and I have to meet you.
Yeah, because that's very unusual.
I was with a bunch of Rosicrucian friends, and we were all into him in the 80s, and we'd watch him all the time. Look at these, he's putting out Masonic stuff. He's putting out Rosicrucian stuff. Who is this guy?
Right? I remember, and there's so many videos. His wife is trying to re-archive everything.
Oh, great.
There was rain damage, and she's just as mad as he always was because she needs money and help to like get all these tapes out, and she puts them on YouTube. But I remember my dad, when I was 12 years old, sitting in the audience here in Southern California, and I was listening to him on stage, and my dad's crying, and right after one of his biggest sermons was fire, 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 and my dad whispers to me, and he goes, "Run backstage and go get his autograph." And I'm just obedient little girl. I grab a piece of, I think I had a Bible. I run outside, I open the side door, but because he was being followed and he had like a security team.
Oh yeah, he did.
Body slammed me against the wall. He walks out and turns, and he's this big, tall, looming guy with the piercing blue eyes.
With white hair, shaka white hair.
He looks like you. And he turns around, and he stands here, and he looks deep into my soul to see if I'm going to do something to him. But I was only 12, and so he just walks away, gets in the car, and he just gives me that look like that wasn't a good move.
Wow.
But it was so great because I got that moment that I got to look at him in the eyes. But yeah, for
that's rare.
God is very special.
Yep.
Very honest man. So okay, so yes, now we can leave, and thank you so much. And
we can do this once a week for a while if you'd like.
I would love to, because this information is timely, needs to come out now. People need to understand what's going on. There's a lot of people out there putting information that's not super accurate.
That's another point I want to make, again, because people think I'm very judgmental and critical, but a lot of people in this new agey thing, and a teacher I had, Nick Nocerino, hated the term new age. It's the now age. We're bringing back ancient wisdom. How is it new? But anyway, people like to give out this, oh, everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else. Oh, everybody's theory is equal to everybody else. Well, not. Everybody's opinion is not equal. Everybody's theory is not equal.
Right.
You have to do the work. You have to do the work. Okay. Next time it will be Land of Osiris, my first book.
Yes. Please send all the links. I'm going to put it in the description below.
I will.
It's so hard to say goodbye to you. I cannot wait till next week. We're going to talk more. Love you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Blessings, brother.